Sophie remembered thinking that the first time she'd attended one of these galas, 7 years ago, on Cedric's arm, young and bright-eyed and foolish enough to believe that beauty meant belonging. 40 candles per fixture, someone had once told her proudly, as though excess were an achievement worth measuring. Tonight, standing alone at the edge of the marble floor in a gown the color of deep winter slate, she counted them again. Old habit, a way of keeping her eyes somewhere safe. There were 11 chandeliers. She had reached 9 before the first whisper found her. "Is that Sophie Voss, still using his name, poor thing?" She did not turn. She had learned in the 3 years since the divorce that turning gave people the satisfaction of watching the wound open. Instead, she lifted her glass of white wine, barely touched, and moved with quiet purpose toward the exhibition tables near the east wall, where the evening's business introductions were being made. That was why she was here. Not for the chandeliers, not for the memory of what she used to be in this room. She was here because her textile company, Voss and Thread, had been shortlisted for a capital supply contract, and the man who controlled that contract would be at this gala tonight. She was here to work. That was all. The room was everything she expected. Old money dressed in new silk, titles worn like weapons, laughter deployed as a form of dominance. She had grown up adjacent to this world, near enough to understand it, far enough to never quite belong. Cedric had convinced her once that he was the bridge, that with him she would finally arrive somewhere. What she had arrived at was a courtroom, 3 years ago, listening to his lawyer read a statement into the record describing her as emotionally deficient, physically inadequate, and a social liability to the Voss family name. She had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed into marble while the words fell on her like stones, and she had not cried until she was 3 blocks away, alone in a hired cab, moving through the rain. She had rebuilt herself one thread at a time after that. Literally. The textile business had started in a rented room with 2 looms, a loan she wasn't sure she could repay, and a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. 3 years later, Voss and Thread employed 41 people, had a waiting list for its winter fabrics, and had been shortlisted for contracts that would have made Cedric's family take notice. She had not rebuilt herself for their approval, but she would be lying if she said it meant nothing. She was mid-conversation with a pleasant but forgettable trade liaison near the east wall when she heard his voice. Low, easy, calibrated for an audience, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to perform warmth while feeling none. "Good Lord, Sophie." She turned slowly. There was no use in the delay, but she allowed herself those 2 seconds to settle her breathing, drop her shoulders, and arrange her expression into something neutral and unreachable. Cedric Voss had aged the way dishonest men often did, well, on the surface, with a softness accumulating beneath the jaw that no amount of tailoring could entirely conceal. He was dressed impeccably in charcoal and gold, Lady Myrle a half-step behind him in blush silk, her smile already forming in the particular shape of a woman preparing to enjoy someone else's discomfort from a safe distance. "Cedric," Sophie said, simply his name. No warmth, no hostility. A door neither opened nor slammed. "I didn't think you were still attending these things," he said, his gaze moving over her in the way she remembered, assessing, measuring, finding. "Still with the little fabric business, are you?" "Still, yes," she said. The trade liaison beside her had gone quiet, sensing something he didn't understand but wisely wanting no part of. He drifted away with a murmured excuse. She noted his departure the way one notes the closing of a small exit. "Good for you." Cedric's tone carried the particular warmth of a man who found her survival mildly amusing. He took a sip of his drink, and then, with the timing of someone who had rehearsed the cruelty to feel natural, he tilted his head and asked, loudly enough for the 3 couples drifting past to hear, "Not married yet, Sophie?" "I always said no man of worth would take you. I suppose I was right." Lady Myrle touched his arm with a soft laugh as though he had made a harmless joke. The couples nearby did not laugh, but they slowed. Someone looked over. The whisper economy of a room like this worked quickly. Within 40 seconds, 11 people within earshot had registered the exchange. She could feel it, the recalibration of attention, the faint circling. Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. She had imagined this encounter before, in the way that wounded people rehearse confrontations in the dark. She had imagined herself cutting, brilliant, devastating. She had prepared sentences in the mirror of her rented apartment that she had never needed to use. But standing here beneath 40 candles a fixture, she found that what she felt was not the rage she had rehearsed. It was something colder, and much, much quieter. "Good night, Cedric," she said. She turned and walked toward the terrace doors with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had somewhere better to be, even if in that moment she did not. The night air met her at the threshold, cold and indifferent and clean, and she stepped into it, setting her wine glass down on the stone balustrade and pressing both palms flat against its surface. She looked out at the dark garden below and breathed. Behind her, the gala continued its gilded noise, and the stone was cold beneath her hands, and she was still here. She was still here. A sound reached her then, deliberate footsteps, unhurried, crossing the terrace toward her. She didn't turn immediately. She was tired of turning, but something in the quality of the silence that arrived with those footsteps made the night feel suddenly different, heavier, more inhabited. She turned. He was not what power usually looked like. She had met powerful men before, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in rooms exactly like the one she had just escaped. They announced themselves. They filled space aggressively, wore their authority like a second coat, ensured that everyone within radius understood the hierarchy before a single word was exchanged. Power, in her experience, was loud. This man was not loud. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that suggested he had long ago stopped needing to fill silence with performance. Dark hair, a jaw cut with quiet severity, eyes that caught the light from the ballroom windows and held it without giving anything back. He wore black simply, without ornament, and he stood at a distance that was respectful and yet somehow absolute, as though the space between them were territory he had chosen deliberately. He looked at her the way very few people ever had. Not with pity, not with assessment, with attention, the rare, complete kind that asked nothing in return. "The stone is cold," he said. "You've been pressing your hands against it for 4 minutes." She blinked. "You were watching." From across the hall before the terrace, he paused. "I wasn't the only one." She understood what he meant. She looked back at the garden. "I'm aware." He does that often. The question was quiet, without performance. Often enough. She glanced at him sideways. "You don't need to. This isn't a situation that requires rescue." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He moved to the balustrade, leaving considerable space between them, and looked out at the same darkness she had been studying. "I came for the air. The room is insufferable." Despite everything, the corner of her mouth moved. "The chandeliers alone are a form of assault." 40 candles each," he said. 11 fixtures, I counted." She turned to look at him fully then. Something shifted, not recognition exactly, but the feeling of something familiar in an unexpected place, like hearing a song you know in a language you don't. She studied his profile and found nothing she could name, and yet. "You count them too," she said, "when I need somewhere safe to look." He turned and his eyes met hers, and the night did something strange and quiet between them. "My name is Aldrich." "Sophie," she said. He nodded once, as though her name were something he was carefully setting down rather than merely hearing. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, and it occurred to her that she was not uncomfortable, which itself was strange enough to note. "You rebuilt something," he said eventually. "Not a question. A business, from almost nothing." She paused. "How could you possibly know that?" "The way you held yourself when he spoke." He kept his gaze on the garden. "Not the posture of someone who was broken. The posture of someone who has been broken, repaired themselves, and is quietly furious that the work required it at all." The accuracy of it landed somewhere beneath her ribs. She was quiet for a long moment. "We've met before," she said slowly. "It wasn't a certainty, only the gathering of one. Haven't we?" He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression opened carefully, like a man unlatching a door he had waited some time to open. "A mountain road," he said. "6 months ago. A storm that had no business being that violent in early autumn." The memory arrived whole and sudden. The rain had been merciless. Her carriage wheel had split on a rock she never saw coming, and the driver, bless him, had gone ahead on horseback toward the nearest village for help, leaving her with a lantern, a traveling case, and the particular species of loneliness that only arrives when you are stranded and have no one to send word to. The inn had materialized out of the dark like a rumor. Inside, a fire. Inside, a man already seated beside it reading, who had looked up without surprise and said only, "There's another chair." They had not exchanged names. She hadn't thought to ask. He hadn't offered. They had talked instead about everything and nothing, the way strangers sometimes do when the ordinary social mathematics are suspended by circumstance. He had asked her what she was traveling toward. She had told him honestly that she wasn't sure yet, that she was still in the process of becoming something, and the destination kept revising itself. He had said, "That's not lostness, that's construction." She had left before dawn, before he woke. She had stood in the doorway of the inn for a long moment, looking at him sleeping in the chair, book closed on his chest, fire low, his face entirely unguarded, and she had felt something she had no language for. She'd taken a page from her traveling journal and written, "Thank you for reminding me I'm still here." She had left it on the table beside his cold cup of tea and walked into the first gray light of morning. "That was you," she said. The words came out barely above a breath. "That was me. You didn't tell me who you were. You didn't ask. And I found," he said carefully, "that I didn't want the conversation we were having to become a different one." She understood this precisely. She had spent 3 years having different conversations than the one she wanted, conversations shaped by what she had lost, what she was owed, what people thought she was worth. The man in the inn had talked to her as though none of that existed, as though she were simply a person mid-construction, and that was more than enough. "You found me," she said. "Afterward. It took 11 weeks. A pause. You had left only a first name on that note, and you had paid the innkeeper in cash. And when you found me..." He was quiet for a moment. "I cleared the debts your former husband had fraudulently attached to your business accounts after the divorce. 3 of them. The largest would have collapsed your spring order." The breath left her slowly. She stared at him. That was anonymous. That came through a legal intermediary I never knew who." "I know." "Why?" "Because you had built something worth protecting," he said, "and I was in a position to protect it. And I did not want you to know it was me until you had decided what you thought of me as only a man." She was quiet for a long time after that. The garden below was dark and still. Somewhere inside, a string quartet had begun something melancholy and beautiful. "You courted me," she said slowly, "for 3 months. The letters. The visits to the trade offices. The evening at the Callaway exhibition where you spent an hour asking me about looms." She paused. "You never once mentioned a title." "I mentioned my name," he said simply. "I waited for you to want the name." She turned to face him completely. Her heart was doing something measured and serious inside her chest. "Aldrich," she said, "what is your full name?" He held her gaze with complete steadiness. "Aldrich Kalen Varon," he said, "Duke of Varon, first seat of the Northern Accord, and," he added quietly, "your husband these past 2 weeks if you'll still have the title." The night held its breath. She thought of the small chapel, the rain against the windows, the officiant who had seemed mildly stunned throughout. The moment she had said "I will" to the man she knew simply as Aldrich, who had laughed quietly and said thank you as though she had done him the favor. "You married me," she said, "before I knew." "You knew everything that mattered," he said. "The rest is paperwork." She laughed genuinely, unexpectedly, and the sound of it surprised even her. He looked at her with something unguarded and unashamed, the same face she had last seen sleeping in a chair beside a dying fire while rain threw itself against old glass. She straightened, squared her shoulders, looked toward the warm light of the ballroom. "Shall we go back inside?" she asked. He offered his hand. She took it. They crossed the threshold together. It was a small thing, a man and a woman stepping through a pair of open doors into a lit room. It happened a dozen times an evening at gatherings like this. And yet something in the quality of their entrance, the unhurried certainty of it, the way his hand held hers not possessively but completely, the way she carried herself as though she had decided, somewhere between the cold stone balustrade and this warm threshold, to stop apologizing for the space she occupied, made the nearest cluster of guests turn first. Then the next. Then the next. It moved through the room the way a held breath moves through a choir, one person releasing it, then another, until the silence was no longer individual but collective. The string quartet continued playing for approximately 16 more seconds before even the musicians lost their concentration. The melody stumbled, recovered, then quietly dissolved into nothing. Sophie felt it all without looking at any of it. She kept her eyes forward, her chin level, her hand steady in his. Beside her, Aldrich was entirely unchanged. The room's recognition of him registered nowhere on his face. He had worn this his whole life, the weight of being seen, and had long ago learned to move beneath it without bowing. Henrik appeared from the left, Aldrich's quiet shadow, and leaned close enough to murmur, "You have approximately 30 seconds before Lord Harlow descends in full panic and offers you his best chair, his best wine, and possibly his eldest daughter." "Tell him to keep all three," Aldrich said pleasantly, and Henrik withdrew with the ghost of a smile. It was Lord Cedric Voss who broke first. He had been holding court near the champagne table. Sophie could have predicted the location precisely, with Lady Myrle and a semicircle of minor nobles who laughed at the appropriate intervals. She watched, from across the room, as the ripple of recognition reached him, watched him turn to see what everyone else was looking at. Watched his gaze travel past Aldrich first, a man he perhaps recognized in the abstract, the way one recognizes a national monument without quite believing in its presence, and then land on the woman beside him. The glass in Cedric's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He crossed the floor. Of course he did. Cedric had never possessed the self-preservation instinct that would have told him clearly to remain exactly where he was and spend the rest of the evening being very quiet and very small. He walked toward them with the momentum of a man who had not yet received the information that would have stopped him, his expression arranging itself into something between confusion and the reflex of dominance. "Sophie," he said, and then his eyes moved to Aldrich fully and something in his face changed, the color first, then the architecture of his smile, the whole structure of his confidence quietly evacuating the premises. Forgive me, I don't believe we've been." "Aldrich Varon," Aldrich said. He did not extend his hand. He did not adjust his posture. He simply said his name the way mountains simply exist, without request, without apology, without any apparent interest in what you made of them. "Duke of Varon, and you are speaking to my wife." The three words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. My wife. The silence that followed was the particular kind that a room full of people produces when every individual in it has simultaneously decided that breathing too loudly might cause them to miss something. Lady Myrle had gone the color of old wax. The semicircle of minor nobles had developed a sudden collective interest in their footwear. Somewhere near the east wall, a woman whispered something to her companion, and the companion's champagne glass tilted dangerously in a slackened hand. Cedric's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Sophie, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since the courtroom 3 years ago, and she saw the precise moment he understood. Not just what she had become, what she had always been. What he had discarded, named worthless, handed back as though she were a thing that could be returned. She had prepared once for a moment like this. She had imagined many versions of it, the cutting remark, the cold smile, the devastating precision of a woman who had earned the right to draw blood. In none of those rehearsed versions had she felt what she actually felt now, standing here in winter slate with her husband's hand in hers. She felt nothing toward him, not rage, not satisfaction, not even the clean electricity of vindication. She felt pity. Quiet, genuine, almost unwilling, the kind that arrives not as a performance of grace but as the simple recognition of a diminished thing. "Cedric," she said, his name again, still just a door, neither opened nor slammed. "I hope the rest of your evening is pleasant." She turned away. That was all. No final blow, no lingering look, no savoring of his undoing. She simply turned, the way one turns from a window when the view has become familiar enough to release. Aldrich's hand found the small of her back as they moved through the parting crowd, and she felt the warmth of it through the slate-gray silk, steady, present, asking nothing. Lord Harlow appeared exactly as Henrik had predicted, flustered and ceremonial, and Aldrich spoke to him briefly and kindly, and without ever making Sophie feel like an accessory to the conversation. She was introduced as the Duchess Varon to 4 people in the space of as many minutes, and each time she heard it she felt not the grandeur of a title but something quieter and more permanent beneath it. She felt simply like herself, fully, finally. They did not stay long after that. It was Sophie who suggested leaving, and Aldrich who agreed immediately, without theater, without the pretense that the gala held anything worth remaining for. They retrieved her wrap from the attendant, declined Lord Harlow's offer of the private carriage, and walked out into the cold night air together, down the stone steps of Harlow Estate and onto the gravel drive where their own carriage waited in the dark. He handed her up the step. She paused there, half inside, and looked back once at the estate, the obscene chandeliers burning gold behind the tall windows, the silhouettes of people already rearranging the story of what they had witnessed into something they could carry home and trade. She looked at it all, this world that had whispered about her and measured her and found her insufficient, and she felt it mean less than it had ever meant. She looked at Aldrich, waiting patiently below her on the gravel, his face tipped up toward hers, the night air moving through his hair, his expression carrying that same quality she had first seen in a firelit inn on a mountain road, open, unhurried, asking nothing. She had not married for revenge. She understood that now with a clarity that settled into her bones like warmth after cold. Revenge would have required Cedric to matter. Revenge would have kept her orbit fixed around the wound rather than the light. She had married because, on a rain-soaked night when she was stranded and half-lost and somewhere in the middle of becoming herself, a stranger had offered her a chair by the fire and talked to her like she was already whole. She had married because he had found her quietly and protected what she built without asking for credit. She had married because when she said "I will" in a small chapel with rain on the windows, she had meant it for herself as much as for him, a declaration not of arrival but of choice. She had married because she was still here, and she had finally decided that was everything. She descended the step, took his hand, and did not look back again.